550 KTRS. It was just announced not too long ago, a few moments ago, that the 2014 Time Person of the Year is the Ebola fighters. Jeffrey Kluger joins us, Times editor at large. Jeffrey, welcome to St. Louis, and welcome to the Big 550 KTRS.
Thank you for having me.
So the Time Person of the Year, explain it, because a lot of people still get confused. It's not necessarily an honor, right? I mean, what's the idea behind it?
Well, certainly this year it's an honor, but the original charge for this issue from Henry Luce, one of the magazine's founders, was to choose the person who, for better or worse, most affected global events. Now, we have rarely chosen a bad guy, but we have. We've chosen Stalin, we chose Adolf Hitler, we chose Ayatollah Khomeini shortly after the hostages were seized in 1979. So we have chosen bad guys in the past, but overwhelmingly we've chosen people who have affected events generally for the better, and in this case, this year's case, it's hard to argue that there is anyone who's shown more courage and more compassion than the people who've been willing to walk into this viral fire and take care of people who otherwise would not have gotten the kind of medical attention they needed.
And unlike people who have walked into the fire before, when they walked out, nobody wanted them near them.
Well, that's exactly right. Doctors became patients, and even those doctors who didn't become patients were seen as pariahs because they had been too close to people with Ebola, and there was too great a risk that they were infectious, even though they weren't. If they were asymptomatic and it was early, they weren't infectious. But they were treated as somehow dangerous, somehow infectious, somehow to be quarantined or banished. And this is I mean, it's a bad thing for anybody to feel that way, but when you feel that way after you've done something that's so noble and so wholly good, it just it seems profoundly unjust.
One of a number of the sort of nominees, if you were the Ferguson the Ferguson protesters here in St. Louis. Seems like this year you went with groups as opposed to individual peoples, but as you can imagine, the Ferguson protesters would have caused all sorts of controversy for a time. What was the reason for the nomination, and what was the reason why they didn't win out?
Well, it was less. We ultimately made them first runner-up as opposed to Persons of the Year, not because we were afraid of the public relations blowback, but because they fell just a little bit short in terms of global influence. Look, this is a critically important issue in the U.S. We've been having this argument with ourselves. We've been having this debate and this conversation with ourselves for the last 3 centuries practically, or even more, and it comes up again and again and again. The people who protested, for better or worse, raised critically important issues that have to be reckoned with. But it is very much a domestic issue. It is very much an American issue. And while it's important for us, the Ebola fighters were wrestling with a global issue. For a lot of people, it's an existential issue. There's so much to learn from what went wrong and what is now slowly going right in managing this epidemic, and it can be useful in treating other epidemics down the line in the future. So it was hard to argue that these people weren't significantly and very persuasively somewhat more deserving of this award than others were.
The protesters, though, they can't even agree on who the protesters are, because the protesters say the people who are looting and setting fires, they're not protesters, but they claim to be protesters. It would have been, and I know it's sort of a made-up topic here, but you would have honored or acknowledged looters as well as peaceful protesters together if you would have done that.
Well, we would have acknowledged everybody who took to the streets. We would have, the story that we've written on the Ferguson group parses this in a smart and nuanced way and teases apart people who broke the law from people who didn't break the law, but also acknowledges the larger point, which is people who did things they shouldn't have done and people who remained civil and within the limits of the law were all motivated by the same grief, by the same outrage, by the same injustice. And what we're trying to address there is those larger issues of injustice.
Can I ask you a question, though? How did Taylor Swift make the list?
This has got come up more than once before. Taylor Swift made the list, as did Roger Goodell, as did Tim Cook, because early in the process we reach out to all of the reporters and writers and editors in all of the magazine's beats and say, look, make the case for anyone in your beat, in your area of specialty, in your area of coverage, who, for better or worse, most affected events. There is nobody who wouldn't get a read, wouldn't get a good hearing. So when we narrowed it down to about 8 people, Tim Cook, Roger Goodell, and Taylor Swift were still the greater of, the more influential of all of the people who had fallen off the list by then. Now, clearly they didn't make the very short list, the short list of 5, which was announced a couple of days ago, and the order of finish, which was announced this morning, were people who were significantly more influential, but they at least were in the running until the later rounds.
How about Steve Jobs never being Person of the Year for Time Magazine?
Well, yeah, Steve Jobs has not been Person of the Year. He's been on Time's cover, boy, I've lost count, but many, many, many times, 7 or 8 times, I believe, as long ago as the 1980s. And yes, you could argue that, that he should have been nominated at some point, or he should have been chosen at some point. Except remember, it's sort of like an Academy Award nomination. You can turn in an historic performance that in any other year would have earned you the Best Actor award. But if somebody that year did something just a little bit better, you just keep coming up against the wrong opponent in the wrong year.
So
now,
you're saying that
the year isn't an award as much as it is an acknowledgement.
So you're saying Steve Jobs is this Susan Lucci of the Time of the Year award?
Well, I think Jobs' enthusiasm would certainly say that much, and it's a fair argument. I mean, look at poor Al Pacino. He was nominated again, and it took until Scent of a Woman before he finally won, because there were so many other people nominated against him.
Jeffrey Kluger, Time editor at large, talking about the Time Person of the Year, the Ebola fighters. We're going to take a flamethrower to this place. Jeffrey, thanks for checking in. Have a good day.
Thank you.
You got it. Hoo-ah! That Sense of a Woman was a pretty good movie, by the way.
Yeah, it was. I think I need to see it again, though.
Take a flamethrower to this place.
That's not good.
That's my Al Pacino.
That's not good.
No, that's not bad. Come on, Tim Weiland. That's not bad.
No, Tim. Don't encourage him, Tim.
Tim?
Who needs to encourage him? He does it regardless. That's your Al Pacino.
It's better than Frank Opinion's Barbara Walters.
Well, I agree with that.
That was atrocious. Take a flamethrower to this place.
No.
Tim Weiland, St. Louis Closet Company.